Number 1. Dalia Dippolito. She came home from the gym on a Tuesday morning to find her street sealed off with yellow police tape, squad cars at every angle, and officers moving in and out of her front door. When a uniformed officer told her that her husband Michael had been found dead inside their Boynton Beach home, she collapsed. She wailed. She covered her face and stumbled forward in what most people watching on television would later describe as the most unconvincing display of grief they had ever seen. Because Dalia Dippolito already knew exactly what had happened. She had planned every detail of it herself. The only problem was that none of it was real. Dalia Muhammad was born October 18, 1982, in New York City, to an Egyptian father and a Peruvian mother. She was charming, socially sharp, and had no prior criminal record. She met Michael Dippolito in late 2008. He was a convicted con man on probation who had hired her through an escort service. By February 2009, they were married. Within a month, the trouble began. Prosecutors would later show that Dalia had stolen approximately $100,000 from Michael shortly after the wedding. She allegedly planted drugs in his vehicle twice to trigger a probation violation. She may have attempted to poison his iced tea with antifreeze. Whether she wanted him imprisoned or dead seemed to shift. But what remained constant was that she wanted out of the marriage and wanted his money. By summer 2009, she approached an acquaintance named Mohammed Shihadeh and asked him to help find someone to kill her husband. Shihadeh went straight to the Boynton Beach Police Department. Police set up a sting. Dalia met with a man she believed was a contract killer. He was an undercover detective. The meeting was recorded on audio and video. The officer gave her every opportunity to back out. She told him she was captured on tape, 5,000% sure. She handed over $7,000. The plan was set. What she didn't know was that the television program Cops was embedded with the department during a filming run. On August 5, 2009, officers removed Michael safely from the house, staged the scene with police tape and emergency vehicles, and called Dalia at the gym. When she arrived, an officer told her Michael was dead. The cameras captured everything: her wailing, stumbling, face-covering performance on the driveway. And it was broadcast nationally, replayed endlessly. AM became one of the most watched pieces of true crime footage in the internet history. Minutes later at the station, detectives revealed Michael was alive. The scene had been staged. Every conversation had been recorded. She was under arrest for solicitation to commit first-degree murder. What followed stretched nearly 8 years across 3 trials. Her first conviction in 2011 was overturned on appeal after a juror had been contaminated by inadmissible information during selection. Her second trial in 2016 ended in a deadlocked mistrial, 3-3, after her defense argued the whole plot had been staged to audition for a reality television show. Her third trial in 2017 ended in a guilty verdict in 90 minutes. Judge Glenn Kelly sentenced her to 16 years. Her projected release date is February 21st, 2031. She is currently incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Facility. Michael Dippolito is still alive. Number 2. Casey Anthony. On the afternoon of June 16, 2008, a 2-year-old girl named Kaylee Anthony walked out of her grandparents' home in Orlando holding her mother's hand. It was the last confirmed time anyone outside the family would ever see her alive. What followed over the next 31 days was not a frantic search. It was shopping trips, nightclub appearances, a tattoo, and a rotating cast of boyfriends, while somewhere, the little girl from those family photos was gone. Casey Anthony was born March 19, 1986, and grew up in Orlando with her parents George and Cindy. She gave birth to Kaylee on August 9, 2005, at 19. They moved in with George and Cindy, and Kaylee became the light of that household, bright-eyed and adored in every photograph. Underneath, Casey had grown restless. By June 2008, she was in a relationship with a man named Tony Lazaro and had mentally stepped out of her life as a mother entirely. The last confirmed photograph of Kaylee was taken June 15, 2008, Father's Day. The following afternoon, Casey and Kaylee left the family home together. Kaylee was never seen again. Casey spent the next 31 days at Tony's apartment, going to nightclubs, shopping at Target and JCPenney on dates captured by surveillance cameras, and competing in a nightclub hard body contest on June 20th. 4 days after Kaylee disappeared. On June 18th, she borrowed a shovel from a neighbor and returned it an hour later, when her father George retrieved her abandoned car from a tow lot on July 15th. He testified the odor from the trunk reminded him of something he had encountered only a few times during his law enforcement career. That same day, Cindy confronted Casey and learned Kaylee had not been seen for a month. Cindy called 911. Casey told police she had left Kaylee with a babysitter named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez at an apartment complex on Sawgrass Avenue. Officers drove there immediately. No one by that name had ever lived at that address. Casey was arrested for child neglect and providing false information. Cadaver dogs hit on the scent of decomposition in Casey's trunk. Air samples confirmed the presence of compounds consistent with human remains. Computer records showed searches on the family computer for chloroform, neck breaking, and how to make chloroform. On December 11, 2008, a utility worker named Roy Kronk found skeletal remains in a wooded area less than half a mile from the Anthony home, inside a laundry bag wrapped in a blanket with duct tape near the jaw. The remains were Kaylee Anthony. The medical examiner ruled homicide, cause undetermined. The trial opened May 24, 2011. Defense attorney Jose Baez declared in opening arguments that Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool on June 16th. And that George Anthony had covered it up to protect Casey from a child neglect charge. He also alleged Casey had been sexually abused by her father and brother, allegations both denied under oath. Casey never testified. After 10 hours and 40 minutes of deliberation, on July 5, 2011, the jury returned. Not guilty of murder, not guilty of manslaughter, not guilty of child abuse. Guilty only on 4 counts of lying to law enforcement. Time served. On July 17th, Casey Anthony walked out of the Orange County Jail at midnight. No one has ever been charged in connection with Kaylee's death. Number 3, Aileen Wuornos. She was born on a leap day, February 29, 1956. And from her first moments, the world failed her at every turn. Her father was sentenced to life for raping a child and died by suicide in prison without ever meeting her. Her mother abandoned both children before Aileen turned 4. She was raised by alcoholic grandparents in Rochester, Michigan, in a household that offered nothing resembling safety. She has stated she was physically and sexually abused throughout childhood. At 14, she was raped by a friend of her grandfather and became pregnant. She gave birth, surrendered the child for adoption, and was expelled from the family home. She was 15 years old and entirely alone. She drifted through the 1970s and early 1980s, hitchhiking, petty crime, prostitution, a string of arrests across multiple states. A marriage at 20 lasted 9 weeks before dissolving in violence. In 1986, at a bar in Daytona Beach, she met Tyria Moore. They began a relationship, the closest thing to stability Aileen had ever known. She supported them both through sex work along Florida's highways. On November 30th, 1989, Richard Charles Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner, picked her up along size 75. His body was found in Volusia County in December, shot multiple times. Wuornos said she fired in self-defense after he violently assaulted her. The prosecution argued he had been robbed and killed. That's a fact that emerged later. Mallory had a prior conviction for attempted rape in Maryland. That detail did not make it into her trial. What followed was harder to frame in self-defense. David Spears, 43, was found shot 6 times in June 1990. Charles Carskadden, 40, shot 9 times. Peter Seams, 65, disappeared in June 1990. His car found abandoned, his body never recovered. Troy Burris, 50, found shot twice in July. Charles Humphreys, 56, a retired Air Force major and former police chief, found shot 6 times in September. Walter Antonio, 62, shot 4 times in November. 7 men, 7 roadsides across Florida. The break came from pawn shop records. Items belonging to Mallory were traced to a storage unit linked to Wuornos. A thumbprint matched her criminal database records. Yet witnesses who saw 2 women abandon Seams' car provided a palm print that matched. Composite sketches circulated. On January 9, 1991, Wuornos was arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County on an unrelated weapons warrant. Tyria Moore, contacted by detectives, agreed to cooperate. In recorded calls with Warnos, she drew out a confession. On January 16th, Warnos admitted to killing Richard Mallory. She was tried only for Mallory's murder in January 1992. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. Guilty. Death sentence. She entered no contest pleas on the remaining 5 prosecuted murders and received a death sentence in each. 6 death sentences total. On death row, she was adopted by born-again Christian Arlene Prala. A documentarian, Nick Broomfield, filmed her twice, the second time capturing her unraveling mental state with devastating clarity. She fired her own appellate lawyers, told the court she would kill again, and pushed actively for her own execution. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46. Her final words were a rambling monologue about religion and spaceships. Charlize Theron won the Academy Award the following year for portraying her in Monster. The real Aileen Wuornos was already gone, leaving behind a case that still divides criminologists, advocates, and viewers about what justice actually looked like in this story. Number 4. Danny Rolling. It was the last week of August 1990, and thousands of students were arriving at the University of Florida in Gainesville for the start of a new school year. Somewhere among those arriving students, a 36-year-old drifter from Shreveport, Louisiana, was quietly setting up a campsite in the woods near one of the apartment complexes just off campus. He had a K-bar knife, a set of tools, and a stated ambition to become as infamous as Ted Bundy. Within 72 hours, 5 young people would be dead, and a college town would never fully recover. Daniel Harold Rolling was born May 26, 1954, in Shreveport, the son of an abusive police officer who told his son from childhood that he was unwanted. Rolling drifted through an adolescence of instability, dropped out of school, bounced through robberies and burglaries across multiple states, in and out of prison. The violence had already shown itself before Gainesville. In November 1989, 3 members of a Shreveport family, William Grissom, 55, his daughter Julie, 24, and his grandson Sean, 8, were found murdered in their home. Julie's body had been posed. Rolling was in Shreveport at the time. In May 1990, he shot his father twice during a confrontation. His father survived. Rolling fled to Florida, committed a rape in Sarasota in early August, then drove to Gainesville. In the early hours of August 24, 1990, Rolling broke into an apartment shared by UF freshman Sonia Larson, 18, and Christina Powell, 17. Both were killed. He staged the scene before leaving. The following night, August 25th, he targeted Krista Hoyt, 18, a Santa Fe Community College student. He entered her apartment, waited, and attacked when she returned. She was killed. He staged the scene in a manner so deliberately disturbing that responding officers would spend years struggling to process what they had walked into. On August 27th, he entered an apartment occupied by UF students Manuel Taboada, 23, and Tracy Pauls, 23. Taboada fought back. The evidence showed he fought hard. It wasn't enough. 5 students, 4 days. Gainesville fractured. Parents arrived to pull their children out of housing. Campus locked down. Classes were suspended. Some students who left that week never came back. The city lived in the kind of fear that embeds itself in streets and sidewalks and dark spaces between buildings. Investigators zeroed in on the wrong suspect first, a 19-year-old UF student named Edward Humphrey with pending assault charges and erratic behavior. His bail was set at $1 million. The media ran with the story. He was innocent. He served 14 months on unrelated charges before being exonerated. The real break came September 7, 1990. When Rolling robbed a Winn-Dixie in Ocala and was arrested the same day. At his campsite near the Gainesville apartments, police had already found a screwdriver matching tool marks at 3 crime scenes, blood-type evidence linking both the Gainesville and Shreveport scenes, and a cassette tape recorder. When investigators played the tape, they found audio diary entries referencing the crimes. In November 1990, a woman named Cindy Juracich called the Crime Stoppers hotline and named Danny Rolling. DNA from the Florida scenes matched him. The Shreveport murders matched his blood type. Rolling was charged in November 1991 with 5 counts of first-degree murder. His trial opened in February 1994, and before testimony began, Rolling stood and entered guilty pleas on all 5 murders. The courtroom went silent. Families who had braced for weeks of testimony were left in stunned grief. Judge Stan Morris sentenced Rolling to death on all 5 counts. On October 25, 2006, at age 52, he was executed by lethal injection. Minutes before, he had handed his spiritual advisor a written note confessing, for the first time in a court-admissible context, to the 1989 Shreveport murders. He sang a gospel hymn as his final words. He did not address the victims' families watching from the gallery. And Kevin Williamson used the case as the foundation for the 1996 film Scream. The 5 students Rolling murdered are memorialized on the 34th Street wall near the UF campus. The painted words read simply, "Remember 1990. Number 5, John Coey." Every parent who has ever tucked a child in for the night and assumed the world would hold still until morning, this case is for them. Because on the night of February 23, 2005, in a quiet mobile home on Sonata Avenue in Homosassa, Florida, a 9-year-old girl named Jessica Marie Lunsford said her prayers, kissed her grandmother goodnight, and went to sleep in her bedroom wearing pink pajamas. It was a ritual Ruth Lunsford described as routine, the same every night, warm and ordinary and safe. By morning, Jessica was gone, and the man who had taken her had been living the entire time, 65 yards away. Jessica Lunsford was born on October 6, 1995, and by all accounts, she was an uncomplicated, joyful child. The kind of little girl who lit up the people around her without effort. She lived with her father, Mark, and her grandparents, Archie and Ruth, in their modest home in Citrus County, a quiet community in Central Florida's Nature Coast region. Her parents had divorced when she was very young, and Jessica had been raised largely by her father and grandparents, who by every measure adored her. She was in the 3rd grade. She had a purple stuffed dolphin that her father had won for her at a fair, and she took it virtually everywhere. There was nothing remarkable about her life except that it was hers, and that those who shared it treasured it completely. 65 yards away, in a trailer on Snowbird Court, a man named John Evander Coey had been quietly existing on the margins of the neighborhood for months. Coey was 46 years old in the winter of 2005. He had a criminal record stretching back to the 1970s. Dozens of arrests for burglary, drug offenses, and related crimes, and at least 1 prior conviction for a sex offense against a child. He was a registered sex offender under Florida law and was required to report any change of address to authorities. He had stopped doing so. The state did not know where he was. His half-sister Dorothy Dixon, whose trailer he shared, apparently saw nothing alarming in his presence. He occupied a bedroom in the middle of the home and was, by most accounts from the people who lived with him, unremarkable. And yet, records indicate he had previously noticed Jessica Lunsford playing in her yard. He described her, in his later confession, as looking to be about 6 years old. In the early hours of February 24, 2005, John Coey entered the Lunsford home through an unlocked door while the family slept. He reached the bedroom where Jessica was sleeping. He woke her and told her he was taking her to her father. She went with him. Back at the trailer, across a stretch of ground so short that investigators would later measure it at 65 yards, Coey brought Jessica into his bedroom. What she endured over the days that followed, while her father and hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers searched every inch of Citrus County, is among the most harrowing details in the history of Florida's missing children cases. Prosecutors would later confirm that she was held captive for multiple days, subjected to repeated assault, and confined at times to a closet in Coey's room when he was not present. Her fingerprints were later recovered from inside that closet. Her blood was found on Coey's mattress. DNA evidence left no ambiguity. During the search, law enforcement officers visited the trailer on Snowbird Court twice. They spoke to the residents. No one said anything. Dixon and 2 others living in the home would later be charged with obstruction of justice for failing to notify authorities after Coey, by his own admission, told them what he had done. Whether they fully understood what was happening inside that bedroom during those days remains a matter of record and of conscience that belongs entirely to them. Coey grew fearful as the search intensified. and police dogs were brought into the area. He made a decision. He told Jessica he was going to take her home, that he just didn't want her to be seen. He persuaded her to get inside a garbage bag. He tied a second bag around her. He bound her wrists with speaker wire. He went out into the yard behind the trailer, dug a hole in the ground, and buried her. She was alive when he started shoveling the dirt. When her body was discovered weeks later, she was found clutching the purple stuffed dolphin, the toy Cooey had allowed her to bring the night he took her from her bed. On March 15, 2005, Cooey was named publicly as a person of interest. By then, he had already fled to Georgia. He was located in Savannah on an outstanding warrant and initially released. The warrant was local only. Citrus County authorities moved quickly. A nationwide warrant was issued on the grounds that Cooey had violated his probation and failed to register his change of address. On March 17, 2005, he was arrested in Augusta, Georgia, and transported back to Florida. The following day, March 18th, he gave a full audio and video recorded confession to detectives in which he described in detail everything he had done. He said he had not meant to kill her. He said he panicked. He said he was sorry. That confession was thrown out. A judge ruled in June 2006 that investigators had violated Cooey's constitutional rights by continuing to question him after he had requested an attorney, a request that had gone unacknowledged. The confession was inadmissible. The ruling was a gut punch to the Lunsford family and to prosecutors, but it did not destroy the case. The physical evidence alone was overwhelming. Jessica's DNA was recovered from Cooey's bedroom in multiple locations. Cooey's DNA was on the mattress. Her fingerprints were inside the closet. And in jail, awaiting trial, Cooey continued making admissions to guards and investigators that were separately recorded and admissible. Prosecutors had what they needed. Because of the intensity of media coverage in Citrus County and the impossibility of finding an uncontaminated local jury, the trial was moved first to Lake County and ultimately to Miami, where it opened on February 12, 2007. The prosecution, led by Brad King, presented the physical evidence and the recorded admissions made outside of the suppressed confession. Jail guards testified about statements Cooey had made in custody. The investigators walked the jury through the forensic connections between Cooey and the crime scene. The defense acknowledged the overwhelming weight of the evidence, but focused on arguing that Cooey's diminished intellectual capacity, his IQ, was tested at around 78, should disqualify him from the death penalty under the Supreme Court's 2002 ruling in Atkins v. Virginia, which barred the execution of individuals with intellectual disabilities. The prosecution contested the IQ findings and argued the standard threshold of 70 had not been met. On March 7, 2007, the jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual battery on a child under 12, and burglary with assault. A week later, after 75 minutes of deliberation, the same jury recommended the death penalty. On August 24, 2007, Circuit Judge Richard Howard sentenced John Evander Cooey to death. In delivering the sentence, Judge Howard read aloud a clinical description of the crime's final moments, and had to stop more than once to compose himself before continuing. He noted that Cooey had caused what he described as a slow, suffering, conscious death. He noted that Jessica had been placed not in one, but in 2 garbage bags. He noted that she was alive when the dirt began to fall. John Evander Cooey never faced that execution. On September 30, 2009, he died of natural causes at a hospital in Jacksonville, Florida, while being transferred from Florida State Prison. He was 51 years old. He had been ill for some time. Mark Lunsford, who had spent the years since his daughter's death traveling the country advocating for tougher laws against convicted sex offenders, told CNN he had never expected to see Cooey actually put to death, given the length of the appeals process. Jessica's grandmother Ruth said she felt no sorrow. The sheriff who led the original investigation said Cooey's death by illness may have been its own kind of justice. What endured beyond all of it was Jessica's law: mandatory minimum sentencing and lifetime electronic monitoring for adults convicted of sex offenses against children under 12, which passed in Florida and has since been adopted in 42 other states. It carries her name. It was all her father could do. Jessica Marie Lunsford would have been 9 years and 4 months old the day they found her in that yard, that she was still holding on to her dolphin. The horror of what happened behind that trailer in Homosassa shook every parent in America. But our next case asks a different question entirely. What happens when the person destroying a family is not a stranger lurking in the dark, but the one person standing at the center of a movement for justice, holding a teenager's photograph and speaking his name to the whole country? Number 6. George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. On the evening of February 26, 2012, a 17-year-old boy walked out of a 7-Eleven convenience store in Sanford, Florida, carrying a bag of candy and a can of iced tea. He was wearing a dark hoodie. He was on the phone with a friend. He was walking back to the townhouse where his father's fiancée lived, at about 70 yards from where he would be shot dead less than 20 minutes later. His name was Trayvon Benjamin Martin, and his death would trigger one of the most consequential public reckonings over race and justice in 21st century America. A reckoning that is still unfolding today. Trayvon Martin was born on February 5, 1995, in Miami Gardens, Florida, the son of Tracy Martin and Sabrina Fulton, who divorced when Trayvon was still young. He grew up primarily with his mother and older brother in Miami Gardens. By the accounts of people who knew him, he was a teenager with an easy manner and a genuine interest in aviation. He had talked about wanting to become a pilot. He was 17 years old and a junior at Crop Senior High School in Miami. In the days before his death, he had been visiting his father in Sanford after receiving a 10-day school suspension. On the evening of February 26th, with his father's fiancée watching television and the night dark and drizzling, Trayvon walked the short distance to a nearby store and back. He never made it through the door. George Michael Zimmerman was 28 years old in February of 2012, a part-time student at Seminole State College who worked in insurance fraud investigation and served as a self-appointed neighborhood watch coordinator for the retreat at Twin Lakes, the gated townhome community in Sanford where his shooting would occur. The neighborhood had experienced a series of break-ins in the preceding months, and Zimmerman had, by his own account, made it a personal mission to be the community's eyes and ears. He called the Sanford Police Department's non-emergency line frequently. He was known for his vigilance. He drove a dark SUV through the development at night, watching. At approximately 7:09 p.m. on February 26th, Zimmerman called the Sanford Police Department's non-emergency line to report what he described as a suspicious person, a teenager in a dark hoodie walking through the complex in the rain, looking at houses, behaving in a manner Zimmerman characterized as odd. "He looks like he's up to no good," Zimmerman told the dispatcher, "or he's on drugs or something." The dispatcher asked if Zimmerman was following the person. Zimmerman said yes. The dispatcher's response was direct. "Okay, we don't need you to do that." Zimmerman said, "Okay." The call ended. At some point after that exchange, Zimmerman got out of his vehicle. Exactly what happened in the minutes that followed has been contested ever since, but the physical result is not in dispute. At approximately 7:17 p.m., a single gunshot was fired. Trayvon Martin was found face down on the grass about 70 yards from the back door of the townhome where he had been staying. He was dead from a single gunshot wound to the chest. The weapon was a 9mm handgun, legally registered to George Zimmerman. When police arrived, Zimmerman was standing nearby with a bloody nose and lacerations on the back of his head, and he told officers immediately that he had fired in self-defense. What made this case instantly combustible, and what transformed it within weeks from a local shooting into a national crisis, was not only the death itself, but the decision that followed it. East Sanford police took Zimmerman in for questioning, then released him without charges the same night. Weeks passed, no arrest was made. The Sanford Police Department maintained they had insufficient evidence to contradict Zimmerman's self-defense claim. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, had initially filed a missing persons report the morning after the shooting. They were not immediately told their son had been killed. When the reality settled, they hired civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, who demanded the release of the 911 calls and a public accounting of why the man who had killed their son was still free. The case went national on March 13, 2012, when media outlets across the country picked up the story. It exploded. The 911 calls were released publicly, and their contents, including Zimmerman's description of Trayvon as suspicious, the dispatcher telling him not to follow, and the audible screams in the background of a neighbor's emergency call, whose origin was fiercely disputed. were dissected on every cable news platform in the country. Within days, rallies calling for Zimmerman's arrest were being held in cities from Miami to New York to Los Angeles. People marched wearing hoodies. The image of a black teenager in a hoodie carrying candy became the symbol of the entire debate. Change.org petitions gathered signatures by the hundreds of thousands. On March 23, 2012, President Barack Obama stepped to the podium at the White House and addressed the nation. He said the shooting should be fully investigated. He said, "If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon." The statement landed with the full weight of its historical significance. The Sanford police chief temporarily stepped down. The state attorney recused himself from the case. Florida Governor Rick Scott appointed a special prosecutor, veteran state attorney Angela Corey, to take over. On April 11, 2012, 44 days after the shooting, Angela Corey announced that George Zimmerman had been charged with second-degree murder. He had turned himself in to law enforcement. He was taken into custody. A case that the Sanford Police Department had effectively closed on the night it happened was now headed for a nationally televised trial. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated and contested at every stage. Zimmerman's defense team, led by attorney Mark O'Mara, argued that the physical evidence supported Zimmerman's account, that Trayvon had attacked him, that Zimmerman had been on his back on the ground when he fired, that the lacerations on his head and the injury to his nose were consistent with his claim that he had been slammed against the pavement. They pointed to a witness who said he saw Martin on top of Zimmerman during the struggle. They argued their client had fired because he genuinely feared for his life, and that nothing in Florida law required him to retreat from a confrontation he had not initiated, though they ultimately did not formally invoke the Stand Your Ground statute, arguing instead traditional self-defense. The prosecution argued that Zimmerman had racially profiled Trayvon Martin, had ignored explicit instructions from a dispatcher, had pursued an unarmed teenager who was committing no crime, and that the result was an unlawful killing. They played Zimmerman's 911 call. They called the neighbor whose emergency call captured screams in the background. Screams Martin's mother testified in open court belonged to her son, and which Zimmerman's father testified belonged to his. The trial opened on June 10, 2013, at the Seminole County Criminal Justice Center, and the nation watched. The jury was composed of 6 women. Testimony ran for 3 weeks. A key prosecution witness was Rachel Jantel, a friend who had been on the phone with Trayvon in the minutes before he was shot. She testified that she heard Trayvon say, get off," before the phone went silent. Her testimony was powerful and, under cross-examination, deeply uncomfortable to watch. She was 17, visibly nervous, and defense attorney Don West's questioning of her stretched across hours. She became simultaneously one of the most scrutinized and most defended witnesses in recent trial history. On July 13, 2013, after 16 hours of deliberations spread across 2 days, the 6-person jury found George Zimmerman not guilty of second-degree murder. They also found him not guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The verdict was announced live on national television. Protests erupted across the country that night and through the days that followed, in New York, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in dozens of other cities. The hashtag Justice for Trayvon had been circulating for months. Within days of the verdict, 3 black women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, published a declaration online that became the founding statement of the Black Lives Matter movement, a direct response to Zimmerman's acquittal and the specific grief of watching that verdict rendered. In February 2015, the United States Department of Justice announced that federal investigators had found insufficient evidence to bring federal hate crime charges against Zimmerman. The investigation was formally closed. In the years that followed, Zimmerman's post-acquittal life became its own ongoing story. Arrests on domestic violence allegations that his partners later declined to prosecute, attempts to auction the firearm he used to kill Trayvon Martin, and a series of lawsuits against the Martin family and others that were dismissed by courts. Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin established the Trayvon Martin Foundation, wrote a book about their son and the case, and became 2 of the most prominent voices in the national conversation about racial justice and the treatment of Black Americans in the legal system. Trayvon Martin was 17 years and 21 days old when he died. He never made it home. He was found with his candy and his iced tea on the wet grass of a Florida suburb, 70 yards from the door. The question of what he encountered in those final minutes, and whether the law as written could ever account for that, remains one of the most unresolved and deeply felt questions in recent American life. The Trayvon Martin case forced an entire country to confront what it means to be perceived as dangerous simply for existing in a space. Oh, but our next case asks a different, darker question. What happens when a school that was supposed to be the safest place in a community becomes the site of its worst day? And whether the justice system can deliver any verdict that feels adequate to that kind of loss? Here is the trimmed version of all 4 cases, kept under 20,000 characters. Number 7. Nicholas Cruz. It was Valentine's Day. Marjory Stoneman, Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, was 20 minutes from the end of the school day when an Uber pulled up and a 19-year-old former student stepped out, carrying a duffel bag containing an AR-15 style rifle, loaded magazines, and smoke grenades. His name was Nicholas Cruz. He had been expelled from this school the previous year. He had come back. Cruz was born September 24, 1998, and adopted as an infant by Roger and Linda Cruz in Broward County. Behavioral problems followed him from preschool: ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, multiple school transfers, documented threats against other students. His adoptive father died young. His mother, Linda, died of pneumonia in November 2017, just 3 months before the shooting, leaving Cruz to live with a family friend. He had already been expelled by then. The warning signs were numerous and documented. In September 2016, a sheriff's deputy and 2 counselors recommended Cruz be committed for a mental health evaluation. In September 2017, a YouTube comment threatening a school shooting was reported to the FBI. Agents couldn't identify the poster. On January 5, 2018, 40 days before the attack, the FBI's tip line received a detailed report about Cruz's guns, an stated desire to kill, and disturbing social media content. It was never forwarded to the Miami field office. It was not acted upon. On February 14, 2018, Cruz arrived at 2:21 p.m., entered Building 12, removed his rifle in a stairwell, and opened fire. In under 2 minutes on the ground floor, he killed 11 people and wounded 13. He moved upstairs, continued shooting, then dropped his weapon, shed his outer clothing, and walked out among fleeing students. He went to a Walmart, a Subway, a McDonald's. Broward County Officer Michael Leonard spotted and arrested him in Coral Springs at 3:41 p.m. 80 minutes after the shooting began, 17 people died, 14 were students: Alyssa Al-Hadef, Martin Duque Anguiano, Nicholas Dwore, Jaime Gutenberg, Luke Hoyer, Kara Lojren, Gina Montalto, Joaquin Oliver, Elena Petty, Ymedo Pollock, Helena Ramsey, Alex Schachter, Carmen Schentrup, and Peter Wang. 3 adults also died. Geography teacher Scott Beigel, who unlocked his classroom door to let students inside before being shot. Assistant football coach Aaron Feiss, who shielded students with his body. And athletic director Chris Hickson. 17 more were wounded. Surviving students, Emma Gonzalez, David Hogg, Cameron Caskey among them, stepped in front of cameras days later and refused to stay quiet. They were angry, specific, and organized. They founded Never Again MSD. On March 24, 2018, the March for Our Lives drew 800,000 people to Washington, D.C. Gonzalez stood at the podium in silence for 6 minutes and 20 seconds, the duration of the attack. Both she and Hogg were targeted by conspiracy theorists claiming they were paid actors. Yet they kept going. Florida passed the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Public Safety Act, raising the gun purchase age from 18 to 21, adding waiting periods and creating a red flag law that issued over 8,000 orders in 4 years. In 2021, a $25 million civil settlement was reached with Broward County Schools. Cruz pleaded guilty on October 20th, 2021, to all 17 murder counts and 17 attempted murder counts. The 2022 trial was a penalty phase only, life or death. The jury toured Building 12, heard months of testimony, and on October 13th, 2022, could not reach unanimity. 3 jurors voted for life. The recommendation was life without parole. Families wept openly. Annika Dwore asked from the courtroom, how much worse would the crime have to be to warrant the death penalty? On November 2nd, 2022, Judge Elizabeth Scherer sentenced Cruz to consecutive life terms on all counts. Victims spoke directly to him for 2 days. Florida subsequently changed state law to eliminate the unanimity requirement for future death penalty cases, a direct response to this outcome. Cruz remains incarcerated with no possibility of release. Number 8. John Goodman. John Goodman had a $200,000 Bentley, a private polo empire, and a gated estate in Wellington, Florida. On the night of February 12, 2010, he climbed into that Bentley after running up a $272 bar tab and drove directly into the life of a 23-year-old engineer named Scott Wilson. What followed became one of the most legally extraordinary cases in Florida history. Goodman was heir to a Houston heating and air conditioning fortune. May he had used that wealth to build the International Polo Club Palm Beach in Wellington, one of the most prestigious polo venues in the Americas. He was socially connected, philanthropically active, and had 2 biological children he adored, and a girlfriend named Heather Hutchins. Scott Wilson was 23 and had recently graduated from the University of Central Florida with a civil engineering degree. He was on his way to visit his family when Goodman's Bentley ran a stop sign at 121st Avenue South and Lake Worth Road. Investigators estimated the vehicle was traveling approximately 63 miles per hour. The impact sent Wilson's Hyundai into a nearby canal. Scott was still strapped into his seat when the car went into the water. He drowned. A bystander named Candace Friel stood at the canal's edge, unable to reach him in time. But Goodman fled on foot and did not call 911 for approximately an hour. When his blood alcohol was tested 3 hours after the crash, it registered 0.177, more than twice the legal limit. Evidence showed he had spent the evening drinking Mind Erasers, a Kahlua, vodka, and tonic mixture, at the Players Club bar before driving. His defense claimed the Bentley malfunctioned and that the alcohol came after the crash, consumed to calm his nerves. Prosecutors presented no evidence supporting either claim. Then came the adoption. In 2011, court documents revealed Goodman had legally adopted his 42-year-old girlfriend, Heather Hutchins. He called it estate planning. Wilson's attorneys called it exactly what it appeared to be: a scheme to reclassify assets as belonging to an additional heir, shielding them from the wrongful death lawsuit. Oh, it made international headlines. His own biological children petitioned the court to block it. The first trial, March 2012, ended in guilty verdicts on DUI manslaughter and vehicular homicide. Judge Colbath sentenced Goodman to 16 years. The conviction was overturned on appeal. A juror had written a self-published book during deliberations that revealed he'd concealed his wife's DUI arrest during jury selection. That juror was later jailed for contempt. The retrial in October 2014 was conducted with a jury bussed in from Tampa. During jury selection, another prospective juror was arrested for Googling the case. The Tampa jury returned identical verdicts. Guilty on both counts. 16 years again. The adoption of Hutchins was later invalidated on appeal. The civil case settled for a reported $46 million. Although terms were officially confidential, Goodman has continued filing post-conviction motions. He is serving his sentence. Scott Wilson, on his way to see his family, still buckled into his seatbelt, is the reason any of it happened. Number 9, Omar Mateen. It was Latin night at Pulse. On June 11, 2016, the weekly event had drawn over 300 people to the small gay nightclub on South Orange Avenue in Orlando. Last call was being served. At 2:02 a.m. on June 12th, a 29-year-old man entered through the southern entrance carrying a Sig Sauer MCX rifle and a 9mm Glock 17. He had purchased both legally in Port St. Lucie days earlier. He had a valid firearms license. He had passed every background check. His name was Omar Mateen. And what he did in the next 3 hours would become the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil since September 11, 2001. Mateen was born in New Hyde Park, Queens, in 1986 to Afghan immigrant parents and raised in Port St. Lucie, Florida. He had a volatile temperament documented throughout his schooling: suspensions, poor grades, behavioral incidents. He trained briefly as a prison guard before being fired for joking about bringing a gun to work. He failed attempts to become a state trooper and gain entry to a police academy. He found work as a security officer with G4S. His first marriage ended in divorce after his ex-wife described him as abusive and controlling. He later married Noor Salman, with whom he had a son. The FBI had twice investigated Mateen before the attack. In 2013, co-workers reported he'd claimed ties to both Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah simultaneously, groups that are ideological rivals. The 10-month inquiry was closed with no charges. In 2014, he surfaced again when a contact became a suicide bomber in Syria. Another investigation, another closure. A mosque friend later notified authorities that Mateen admired Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born Al-Qaeda propagandist killed in 2011. The tip was noted. Nothing was done. In the weeks before the attack, Mateen visited Disney Springs multiple times during gay days. Prosecutors would later reveal he had originally planned to target Disney, purchasing a stroller and doll to conceal a weapon. But security presence spooked him. He shifted his target to Pulse. On June 4th, he bought the rifle. June 5th, the Glock. He gave his wife $1,000 and sent her to California to visit family. Investigators later concluded she had vague foreknowledge of his intentions. At the entrance, off-duty OPD officer Adam Gruler engaged Mateen immediately and was forced back, outgunned. Backup arrived within 2 minutes. Mateen had already moved through the dance floor, firing continuously. In less than 5 minutes, he discharged approximately 200 rounds. People hid in bathrooms and closets, texting families and whispering 911 calls. Imran Yusuf, a Marine Corps veteran working as a bouncer, recognized the sound of the rifle and forced open a back door, allowing dozens to escape. At 2:35 a.m., Mateen called 911, declared allegiance to ISIS, and claimed a car bomb outside. No bomb existed, and over the next hour he spoke with OPD negotiators 3 times, framing the attack as retaliation for U.S. airstrikes in the Middle East. He claimed to be wearing a suicide vest. No vest existed. He was online during the standoff, checking Facebook and searching for news coverage of his own attack. At 5:02 a.m., SWAT breached a wall with an armored vehicle. Mateen moved toward the opening and was shot and killed. 49 people died. 53 were wounded by gunfire. 1 in 3 people inside that building was shot. Because it was Latin night, most victims were of Latino descent. An LGBTQ plus space targeted on a night built for the Latin community, a compound horror the national conversation absorbed slowly. The FBI found no direct operational link to ISIS. The assessment was that Mateen was inspired, not directed. His simultaneous invocations of ISIS and the Tsarnaev brothers, groups with opposing ideologies, suggested a man who had adopted radical violence as an identity rather than a coherent mission. His wife Noor Salman was acquitted at trial in March 2018 after the jury found the prosecution had not met its evidentiary burden, partly because her FBI interrogation had not been recorded. Congress designated the Pulse site a national memorial in 2022. 49 names are inscribed in the national memory. Number 10. Joseph P. Smith. 95 million people were watching the Super Bowl on the evening of February 1st, 2004. In Sarasota, Florida, an 11-year-old girl named Carly Brucia had spent the afternoon at a friend's house and was walking home to watch the game with her family. She was a 6th grader with a pink backpack on her shoulders, less than a mile from her front door. At 6:21 p.m., a motion-sensitive security camera at the rear of Evie's car wash on Bee Ridge Road captured the last moments anyone outside of one man would ever see her alive. Carly Jane Brucia was born March 16, 1992, bright, spirited, loved. Her friend's mother called to check she had permission to walk home alone. She didn't, and her mother immediately sent her stepfather to get her. He arrived to find Carly had already left. She had a head start of only minutes. Joseph Peter Smith was born March 17, 1966, in Brooklyn. By 2004, he had at least 13 arrests in Florida since 1993. Drug offenses, fraud, violence against women, and a prior kidnapping charge for which he had been acquitted. He was an unemployed auto mechanic on probation, having served about 17 months total in prison. 1 month before the abduction, a probation officer had asked a judge to revoke his probation for a technical violation. The judge declined. The car wash footage was released on February 2nd and stopped the country cold. Grainy, but unmistakable. A girl with a backpack, a man in a mechanic's uniform approaching her. A brief exchange, his hand taking hold of her arm, both of them walking off toward a waiting vehicle. And then the camera's reach ending. A second camera had caught a yellow 1992 Buick Century station wagon in the lot minutes before. Amber alerts went out. The manhunt began. Tips flooded in immediately. By February 3rd, the wife of a former business associate saw the footage on television and recognized Smith. Yet her husband confirmed it and told investigators Smith had borrowed the yellow station wagon the afternoon of the abduction, not returning it until the following morning. Smith was already in custody, arrested that same day on an unrelated parole violation. Investigators had a name, a vehicle, and a suspect in a cell 40 miles away. Smith refused to speak. His brother John, estranged from him, was contacted by the FBI. On February 4th, Joseph called John and, in a recorded conversation, admitted he had engaged in a sexual act with Carly in the car, said it had got carried away, and that he had strangled her. When John asked if she was alive, Joseph said, "I don't know, she could be." Joseph directed John toward a church. John went and couldn't find her in the dark. He called the FBI. The next night, with agents listening, and John called again. Joseph guided him to the exact location. Carly's body was found February 5th, 2004, in a wooded area on the property of Central Church of Christ. She had been strangled. Speaker wire ligatures were on her wrists. She was 11 years old. DNA from a semen stain on her shirt matched Smith. Her hair was found in the station wagon. He had written his brother an encrypted letter directing him to 4 trash bins where he'd scattered her belongings. An FBI codebreaker translated it. The evidence was overwhelming. Smith was indicted February 20th, 2004 on first-degree murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery on a child under 12. Trial began November 7th, 2005. John Smith testified against his own brother, recounting the phone call in detail. After 5 hours of deliberation, on November 17th, the jury returned guilty on all counts. Carly's mother, Susan Shorpen, wept in the courtroom and told reporters outside she would never understand why Smith had chosen her daughter. He never answered. On December 1st, 2005, the jury recommended death by a vote of 10-2. On March 15th, 2006, Judge Andrew Owens formally sentenced Smith to death, citing his criminal history, the victim's age, and the exceptional cruelty of the crime. He also received 2 concurrent life sentences for the sexual battery and kidnapping charges. Congress introduced Carly's Law, aimed at strengthening probation revocation rules for violent offenders and sex offenders. A narrowed version passed. Florida also moved to require judges to imprison violent probation violators rather than continuing to release them on bail. In 2016, the Supreme Court struck down Florida's death penalty structure for giving too much sentencing power to judges rather than juries. Because Smith's jury had not been unanimous, 10-2, the Florida Supreme Court ordered a new sentencing hearing in 2021. It was scheduled. It was never held. On July 26, 2021, Joseph Peter Smith died at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. He was 55. Cause of death was not disclosed. Carly's father told reporters he was elated. He said it was long overdue. Carly's mother, Susan Shorpen, did not live to hear it. She died in 2017 of a suspected drug overdose at 47. She never got her answer. She never stopped wanting one. A granite marker stands near the church where Carly was found. A baseball field sits close by, where 11-year-old children take batting practice and make plans for their futures. They pass within a few feet of the marker. Most of them never notice it. That is perhaps exactly how it should be.